Charlotte Sometimes by Penelope Farmer, Chapter 19. Charlotte was awakened suddenly by a sound that filled her head inside and battered it without, bewildering, even terrifying her before she realized what it was, an airliner directly overhead. She'd forgotten about jet planes. Her pillow was now not damp, but she was still wearing Claire's dressing gown. "Goodness, Charlotte, whatever did you go to bed in your dressing gown for?" Susanna asked her curiously. She did not notice the other dressing gown lying at the foot of the bed, and Charlotte thrust it hastily in a drawer, wondering if Claire would be in trouble for having no dressing gown. But it was not a thing she could ever find out, any more than she could find out if Claire had gotten back to her room safely that morning, or been found in bed beside Emily. Whenever Charlotte looked up, she saw Elizabeth staring at her hard. In the washing cubicle, she went on, staring, until finally her face slipped and she grinned. Charlotte grinned back at her uncertainly. Elizabeth looked untidier, more lumpish than ever, her hair wild and flying from the night. "You're back," she said. "I wondered when it would happen." "I'm what?" asked Charlotte, pretending uncertainty till she could be quite sure. "Back," said Elizabeth, "instead of Claire," she added. Charlotte still standing silently. "How did you know?" "I'm so brilliant, of course. Well, I guessed. At least I guessed something was funny. Oh, I guessed it for ages. I asked Claire like I asked you, and in the end she told me. Actually, I think she was quite pleased. It must have been awful for her anyway, and much worse if no one had known anything all the time. I'm glad you knew. I'm glad I had Emily, her sister, and that helped me a lot." In fact, Elizabeth knowing helped Charlotte, helped smooth out the difficulties she had expected, though it did not stop the odd dazed fuzziness she felt, the confusion at the change. In a way, it depressed her that no one else had noticed that she had replaced Claire. "Was Claire very like me then?" she asked Elizabeth one day, cautiously, because still quite shy of her, as well as of this particular question. She was hoping that Elizabeth would answer no, just as she had once hoped Emily would. "No, really no, I don't think she was." "Well, why doesn't anyone notice then?" "Anyone would think you wanted them to," said Elizabeth. After a while she added, "I tell you who in this school Claire did look most like, and that's Sarah Reynolds. You know, the one Vanessa calls Lady Sarah?" "So might Claire look like if she had been Sarah's mother," Charlotte thought confusedly. She had been folding a sweater of Elizabeth's, but let it drop upon the bed and stood for a moment, still and dazed and quiet. "Was Claire like me otherwise?" she went on insisting. "I mean, did she do things like me? What ways were different, Elizabeth?" Her need was to define herself, Charlotte. As much as Claire, she needed it enough to keep on badgering uselessly. "Well, she used to fold my clothes up just like you do. Look," Elizabeth was suddenly exasperated. "Look, Janet and Vanessa are a bit alike, aren't they? And do things alike sometimes, though they're quite different, really. But would you be good at explaining why they were different just like that?" "No, I suppose I wouldn't be. And at least they're both here at once, but I've only seen you and Claire separately." Gradually, Charlotte slipped back into normal living. People no longer looked at her in a peculiar way because she asked the wrong questions or gave the wrong replies. Teachers had gotten over their surprise because she had suddenly become so much worse at netball, but so much better at English. All that was left to her of the past was the nostalgia she felt at unexpected moments when she found coal tar soup in a bathroom, or when they had Chelsea buns for tea. For these had been one of the few nice things to eat in Claire's time. Bunty and Emily used to try to make them last as long as possible, unwinding them carefully and picking out the currants one by one. Coal tar soap is what I meant to say, not soup. Yet all this time, Charlotte still had not talked to Sarah Reynolds. Partly she did not know how to start. It seemed impertinent to question a prefect about her mother, whatever the excuse. Partly she was almost afraid of the answers she might get. So she did not ask her questions. If anything, she found herself avoiding Sarah so as never to have the chance of asking them. She might have gone home at the end of term and still not have known what she wanted to know if her form mistress had not been ill one morning and the register called instead by an elderly teacher, partly retired, who came 2 or 3 times each week to take special classes in geography. Charlotte had seen her but never knew her name. This teacher was a small woman with the bright eyes of an elderly bird and a manner that tried to be gay. She wore her waists tight, as if she had once been had more hip curve below. Indeed, her clothes all looked to have more stuff in them than her shape now needed. She wore a black velvet ribbon in her hair. Vanessa and her friends played her up a little, though they did not dare too much, for she had some authority. They giggled behind desk lids now and then, and answered with voices louder than necessary when their names were called. Vanessa's hand waved suddenly. The teacher was talking to Susanna and did not notice her at first. "Miss Wilkin! Miss Wilkin!" called Vanessa, waving her hand more furiously than ever. Charlotte did not take in the name at once. Then a moment later she gasped, stared unbelievingly. "What's her name?" she whispered, nudging Elizabeth. "What? Who? Oh, her? Miss Wilkin," said Elizabeth, her mind elsewhere. Charlotte stared at this Miss Wilkin, stared and stared and stared. The Miss Wilkin she had known in 1918 must surely be too old now to teach, even part-time like this. Perhaps it was another Miss Wilkin. Wilkin, after all, was not such a very uncommon name. But then she remembered seeing her skip upstairs like a schoolgirl, not like a grown-up woman. Bunty and Emily had thought it funny and giggled afterwards, but it made Charlotte think now that Miss Wilkin must have been very young as teachers went, perhaps no more than 10 years older than Emily herself. Gradually she began to see in this old Miss Wilkin, the younger one, the way she batted her head about and smiled, the jolly eyes, the inappropriately nipped-in waist. On her left hand there was an engagement ring. What would Emily look like now, Charlotte wondered sadly. In a way she wished, as she had wished before, that Claire and Emily had lived long enough ago to be quite safely dead. Not long after, on a December day, the juniors were sent for walks in groups of 5 or 6, each in charge of a prefect. Charlotte, Elizabeth, and Susanna found themselves with Sarah, who walked them briskly to the park, over the river, and up the hill. It was fine when they set out, sunny even, but by the time they reached the track that led to the ponds at the park center, a smooth sheet of black clouds had come up behind them, catching the sun. A little wind had mounted too. Soon the clouds had reached over their heads and beyond. Some short and graceless trees stood here and there, and to these they ran as the rain began. The wind, suddenly huge and furious, making it tear across the bracken stalks and angled veils and sheets, pushing the rain so hard round the trunks of the sheltering trees that they could stand behind them in little dry passages while everything about was drowned. Charlotte found herself sharing a tree with Sarah, but she did not look at her at first. She stood as close up to the tree as she could, rubbing her fingers on its small uneven ribs and letting herself be frightened by the wind quite pleasurably, because so comforted by the tree. She was also thinking of Miss Wilkin and willing herself to ask Sarah what she wanted to know. They could not have been more alone and private than in that wild wind and rain, but whenever she dared look around, Sarah was smiling, just smiling. Not even at Charlotte especially, which disconcerted her, and still for a long time she did not speak. Then Charlotte saw behind them a line of light beneath the clouds, drawing nearer, broadening. The rain would stop soon, and the chance be lost again. In a panic, she blurted the first words out. "Do you remember once about your mother? Do you remember you told me?" "Yes," said Sarah. The rain still fell, but straighter, dabbing at their shoulders, patterning the earth about their feet. Charlotte hurried on desperately. "You said she told you to be nice to me if if a girl called Charlotte came, and I didn't know why, because I didn't think I knew your mother." "Do you think you do now?" "I was just thinking perhaps I did know her after all, only I'd forgotten. I wondered what her name was, you see." "Mrs. Reynolds?" "No, I knew. What I wanted..." Charlotte was blushing more and more confused. Her Christian name. I wondered if... Is it..." She almost said Claire, the name ready on her tongue to echo Sarah, though it did not quite come out. "Do you mind my asking?" "Of course not. Her name is Emily." "Emily!" said Charlotte at last, thunderstruck. "Emily! Not Emily! It can't be Emily!" It's an old-fashioned name, but not as odd as that. Sarah was laughing at Charlotte now, but in puzzlement. No, I don't think it's odd. Of course not. It's just... The rain had stopped now, or very nearly. The others were coming from behind their trees, walking across toward the track. Charlotte looked uncertainly at Sarah and thought she did not move. She took a chance to escape from their conversation herself, or at least from this part of it, marching off over the rough and sodden earth. Sarah followed, caught her up at once. They remained still separate from the rest. When once Susanna seemed about to come, Elizabeth gripped her arm and pulled her back, making a wild sign with her other hand, as if to tell Charlotte she guessed what might be happening. The other three girls remained with their heads together farther up the track. The sun came out and made garish, deep, deceptive colors, made the tumbled bracken bright as red earth. Charlotte thought she even saw red earth, not bracken at all, and her eyes took minutes to correct themselves. Near the ponds there was a group of trees with sick green trunks, but their twigs and branches were glowing red, as if they shed their own light instead of taking it from the sun. The ponds were a harsh battleship color. Their blue-gray water had white flecks in it, like wave crests, but solider. For these were seagulls. They saw, drawing nearer, seagulls bobbing in the swell that the furious wind had raised. The wind had come so suddenly and now was gone. Charlotte and Sarah stood by the water a minute. Sarah bent and hurled a stick. Then they turned away across a bleakness of earth and bone-like grass, where even the sun could scarcely raise a color. Charlotte had recovered by now from the worst of her surprise. She was screwing herself up to ask more questions. Did Emily, your mother, did she have a sister called Claire? She was embarrassed enough now to have asked almost anything. She did, as a matter of fact. I'm called after her. My second name is Claire. But how did you know? She died a long time ago of flu. It seems odd, someone dying of flu. It was just at the end of World War I, so my mother said. She spoke so cautiously that Charlotte would never have known what was about to come. How can she be so cool, so calm? She was thinking. How can she be forgetting that to Sarah it was all only past history, so long ago that Claire was someone she had never known, only heard about. Charlotte, what's the matter? Whatever is the matter? It had taken some minutes even then for the story to sink fully into Charlotte's mind. But suddenly she had soaked it up in new, full grief. She had begun to cry. On the bleak track, the sun almost gone now, tears were pouring down her face. She was crying and crying for a girl who had died more than 40 years before, whom in any normal world, any normal way of thinking, she could not possibly have known, whom she had never even seen, whom she had never even seen, though she had lived as her. She was crying for herself, perhaps, and for Emily. I think Sarah must have thought I was crazy, she said the next day. She had turned off Elizabeth's transistor and dragged Elizabeth to a bathroom and locked the door behind them. She had not wanted yesterday to speak to anyone about it, but now today she did, having awakened curiously, feelingless. Elizabeth was huffy as well as upset about it. You wouldn't talk to me yesterday, would you? Not at all. I knew you were miserable, but you could have said what happened. I liked Claire. I knew her. I'm sorry. I'm awfully sorry, Charlotte said. It was so sad. I didn't know what to do. Don't you mind too? For Elizabeth seemed so much less grief-stricken than Charlotte had been, though picking a sponge to pieces all over the bath. Yes, I do mind. It makes me want to cry. But it's so long ago. It's all over. She was a sort of ghost, really, wasn't she? But I know it can't seem so long ago and gone to you. I suppose I must have been a sort of ghost, too, in 1918, if you can have ghosts from the future. She was a pretty solid sort of ghost, of course, if bony. You could feel her bones, and they felt as hard as yours and mine. You couldn't put your hand through them like you're supposed to with ghosts. Of course, it might have been more interesting like that. Charlotte shuddered. Suppose I hadn't been able to feel my own bones. That would have been horrid. Interesting, though, insisted Elizabeth. Charlotte said tentatively, because the fear had been so deep in her that it seemed dangerous to reveal it even now. Do you know I was afraid of one thing. I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to get back here. And then I thought I might be Sarah's mother. might be me grown up. But you couldn't have been, said Elizabeth. You'd have had to be alive twice over. I mean, little as Charlotte and then grown up as Sarah's mother. Claire, I don't think that would be possible. I used to think ghosts weren't possible, said Charlotte. Elizabeth almost shouted, hands flying, red face. But look, of course, don't you see? That's why Claire couldn't have been Sarah's mother either, because she'd have had to be alive twice at the same time, as you and her. I mean, Sarah's mother. You mean? Said Charlotte, aware for a flash what Elizabeth was saying, though afterwards her brain was dull again. You mean, I mean Claire could only come into the future, into now, because she died, because she isn't alive now. And that's the end of chapter 19.